Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Recovery Corner. I'm your host, Candace Rose, and on today's episode of Recovery Corner, we are discussing harm reduction once again, and I've invited another Colorado friend. We've got Maggie Seldeen. Am I saying that right, Maggie?
That is correct, yes.
And Maggie is the executive director at Rockies Harm Reduction here in Colorado in Eagle County, if I'm not, please correct me if I got that wrong.
Yeah, no worries. We serve Garfield, Pitkin, and Eagle County. And Eagle County is kind of a funky one. So right now we actually only serve like a real small corner of Eagle County and working on expanding services into the actual like Eagle Vale Valley area.
Awesome. Okay, well, I apologize for my confusion there, but Maggie and I got to meet you when we were up in Rifle at the peer conference for rural communities. And then we were sort of like reintroduced at that Eagle County consortium meeting virtually. So I think that was my confusion, but I remember seeing you speak about harm reduction at that conference. And I was like, I've got to get her on the podcast. You speak so passionately and so educated about the work that you're doing. And this is definitely a topic within the continuum of recovery services that I've really been interested in elevating the conversation. So I'm really excited that you were open to be on the show. I'm really happy to have you here. And I also know that you're a woman in recovery. So congratulations on your recovery. And not only that, but the work that you're doing. So yeah, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Candace. Thanks for having me. And yeah, I'm excited to be here.
Yay. Well, I guess before we really kind of dig into the topic that I asked you to speak about today, I'd love to let our listeners know a little bit more about you. So if you just want to kind of share who you are, where you're from, and anything you think that would be interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. So as you said, my name is Maggie Seldeen. It's a very commonly mispronounced and misspelled last name. It's adapted Russian when we came to Ellis Island, my family in the early 1900s, but it's needles spelled backwards. So once you learn more about me, it becomes a little easier to at least spell, maybe. So that's cool because I feel like, there are a few people out there who are literally born with the names of the professions that they find. And it's like, there's no way that's their real name. But in my case, absolutely fascinating to me that that's my given last name, considering that I now, operate the second rural syringe service program in Colorado. And I grew up in Carbondale, which I had to just look it up just to confirm. It was like a town of 3,000 people when I was growing up, and it's doubled since then, as many rural Colorado towns have over the past really 60 years, just a lot of exponential growth in these resort towns. But so when I was growing up, it's about 4,000 people. It's pretty small, but I just grew up in a home with a lot of substance abuse issues, a lot of violence and neglect. And so, that's clearly reflected in a lot of the work that I do, just really understanding what it's like to be growing up in these communities that are generally stereotyped as being very wealthy, but there are definitely impoverished families in these communities, and often with very significant cultural barriers to healthcare services. And so by the time I was, 13, 14 is really when I was in just my full blown alcoholism. Both of my parents were using heroin at the time, and so were all of my friends. And so there was like a real interesting point in time where I was about 14, 15, where everyone I knew was injecting drugs, whether that was cocaine or heroin or whatever. And we would always get lots of calls from the jail at my mom's house and never know who the calls were for necessarily. When I was 15, my dad left town to get sober. And I had to start living with my mom again, who I pretty much I she gave up parental custody, which wasn't really legally done, but a year earlier. And, I hadn't really been around there much and had really been kind of back and forth between my dad's and friends' houses. And so once my dad left, it really became more back and forth between my mom and the streets and friends and things like that. And then she overdosed in February of 2006 from heroin. She had actually been in a rehab facility the previous November around Thanksgiving, because I went out and had Thanksgiving dinner with her at Betty Ford in Southern California, which was convenient because our family actually lives in that area. And so, she, as far as we know, that was like the first time she had used since rehab, which is a really common overdose theme. And so she passed. She actually was in a coma for several months following the overdose, and then was transported to a head trauma facility out in Adams County outside of Denver. And eventually we pulled the plug because there was just, no brain activity for so long. And so that was, a big turning point in my life in kind of both a negative and positive way, because it actually, losing my mom and losing a lot of my ties to the community, having both my parents gone. I did stay in the Roaring Fork Valley for a year after my mom passed with a family friend. But that really allowed me to break the cycle of violence and addiction, even though it would take me many, many years to get there. But I was able to get out of the valley and get out of that environment, which, as my dad illustrated often, that's like a huge thing in recovery, is to really just break away from your friend groups, break away. And it's hard. It's really, starting over. And I spent a lot of time starting over every year and living on the streets and still, drinking and drugging a lot after losing my mom. And I graduated high school like the following year because I just had some really cool teachers that were like, we know you're going to drop out, so let's get you a diploma. And then I also have a GED too, because my grandpa was like, that's BS. You don't have a high school education. So they wanted me to prove it with a GED. My grandpa was like my savior. He was heavily involved financially with my upbringing, but he wasn't physically here. So he was my legal guardian from like before my mom even died, but he wasn't physically here. And I actually am so blessed to have slipped between the system's cracks and not have ended up in foster care. And I was left to really run rampant, but I'm grateful for that, because I think being on the streets and being an alcoholic and all these things, like, those were experiences. I think being in foster care would have been way, way worse and difficult for everyone involved, because I was 15 and already basically independent. So I don't know how that would have gone. And so, it was, just a long time of dealing with my behavioral health issues, really, or I guess not dealing with them. And, long story short, I lost a lot of people before that and after that to overdoses and suicides and, just a lot of DUIs, things where the root is always really like mental health issues. And when I was 23, I went through kind of a nasty, the divorce wasn't nasty. It was just that it was like a divorce. I had to move. I left my job, like all these things at once. I was living in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and it really forced me to, look at my life and like, what am I doing in Santa Fe if I'm not in this relationship anymore? And just, where are we going? And a person in active addiction was actually like the most helpful person to me at that time. Everyone thought this person was toxic. We tried to have a romantic relationship that was really toxic. But at the end of the day, that person, even though they were an everyday meth user and an alcoholic and whatever, just like me, helped me open my eyes to the trauma that I was not dealing with, and that was what was, really messing my life up and projecting that trauma on everything else and coping or not coping by using drugs and alcohol. And so sobriety was, I was definitely aware that I was drinking a lot, but that wasn't even like a thought in my mind. But I started going back to school and I started taking counseling classes, and I immediately started identifying things in myself. They say in psychology, you should never self-diagnose, but I'm a person with a lot of trauma. And so, it really helped me start seeing these issues in myself. And that was also, the beginning of my road of doing the work I do now. I had been volunteering in a street outreach program, a homeless drop-in for youth in Santa Fe. And I really wanted to have a career, working with unhoused people, working with adolescents. And I had been really lucky to have this therapist who had planted the seed in my mind a long time ago. She gave me some of the best pieces of advice I'd ever had right after my mom passed. And they were, you never have to decide what you want to be when you grow up, because you can be a lot of things. And why don't you channel your experiences into helping others with those same experiences? It's like, boom, mind blowing.
Right.
So, I went back to school because I wanted to help people, and my own stuff got in the way. And I, worked at Planned Parenthood, and I worked in a variety of nonprofit settings and volunteered a lot all over my community when I moved back to Colorado in 2015. And so it took me like 7 or 8 years to get a college degree, with actually like 5 years of attending school. And that's with 0 high school education.
Wow.
So it was, a road, but now we're here, and now I'm in this position where I can really give back. And, it's like frustrating. Like, this should have been the goal from day one, like the day I lost my mom to an overdose, or the many days after that I continued to lose friends and loved ones. But I think like the things that have shifted in my own life, and everything that I've learned, and every job that I've had, and everything I've done along the way has put me in this position where now I can create this amazing thing for my community.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, don't discount all the experiences you had, because if you had turned the corner after losing your mom, there's probably a lot of experiences you wouldn't have had, experiences that are, I would expect, really beneficial to the work that you do now, even though that's kind of like, we wish we could avoid some of those hardships and difficult moments, but those are our biggest teachers too. So I don't know, looking at life like everything happens for a reason. I mean, not that it was like manifested that way, but finding value in whatever your past experiences are. Because I think there's a lot of value to whatever happened between the day you lost your mom and then the day that you did turn that corner.
Oh, I absolutely agree. And I think I couldn't be here without every experience I've had, no matter how seemingly meaningful. And I just hear that a lot. People are like, oh, I'm this old and I'm still here. And it's like, I saw this great thing. I think it was Barbara Walters was saying, and it was specifically about women, but in general, like, if you didn't make it in your 20s, you can make it in your 30s. And if you didn't make it in your 30s, you can make it in your 40s. And if you didn't make it in your 40s, and, just on and on to like the 80-year-old who started painting and became like one of the most prolific painters in the world. And I think about just, the whole, like, all these little turning points and the just transgression or whatever of my experiences. Like, I was working, I left a nonprofit that was really stressful and time consuming and on call 24/7 to just work in a chill cashier environment. And in that environment, I was working in the city of Aspen, and it kind of reignited my cultural roots with Judaism, because I used to go to Hebrew school at the Aspen Chapel, where we now provide syringe services every other Monday from 10 to 2. And so just thinking about that, and thinking about like religion in a positive way, as someone who was raised pretty secular. I was very secular Jewish, which makes sense because our God is very vengeful and scary. So we like to just kind of ignore him and do our thing. But, really seeing that in a way that I could connect to it, and not just that, but lots of experiences on a more spiritual level, becoming, and growing up, I'm not old, not becoming an older person, but just growing and becoming less. I think adolescents are just so analytical and black and white. And so for me, it was like, oh, it's obvious that this stuff is nothing. And I think as you get older, it's natural to start kind of questioning spirituality and things like that a little bit more. And just like opening myself up to that made it so much easier to walk into that AA room a year or two later, because that had been such a stigmatizing factor. But then I can now walk into those meetings and hear and speak about spirituality in a way that like I'm comfortable with. And I wasn't planning on starting a syringe service program when I entered recovery officially by quitting drinking. And then a year later, when I was offered a job as a peer recovery support person, it's like, oh, good, because I've been sober for a year and a half. So, or I don't even like, sober is a dirty word for me. I haven't had a drink in over a year and a half. I wasn't planning to build a career out of that, but it just happened very serendipitously.
Yeah, it's an interesting time we live in. I share that experience of like serendipitous events leading to employment. Sometimes, I don't know. Sometimes I kind of joke. I'm like, yeah, I'm a professional alcoholic. Even though I don't like to label myself like that, but in a joking way, because I'm like, yeah, like I found recovery, and now I get to use those experiences that I used to be really ashamed to talk about. Now I'm like not ashamed to talk about it at all, because it wasn't anything to be embarrassed about. Like, I was a person that was hurting, that found a substance that made me feel better. I didn't have the tools or the resources to actually process those things that I was drinking down. But yeah, it's an interesting time that we live in, that now people like us that have been down that dark road can harness those experiences, not only to like do better for ourselves, but also like help the communities around us, and make sure that other people have access to the resources they need, resources that will help keep them alive, such as the harm reduction resources you offer, you and your organization, or just even a sense of community. I think that's also why I'm so motivated to talk about harm reduction, because I feel like folks practicing harm reduction are, for lack of a better word, they're kind of like lepers in the recovery community, especially like traditional programs where, abstinence is the only way. And for a lot of these people, eventual abstinence might be their goal. But for so many of us, like the building block of a solid recovery is finding community and feeling supported and connected. And so through like harm reduction agencies, like just being treated like a human being and being like, if you're not at that point yet, or even if that's not your goal, like we still support you and love you and, want to make sure that you're safe. So I really appreciate you sharing your story and experience. I mean, you've seen all sides of it, you've experienced it yourself. You were a child born into it. So it's just been kind of like, I mean, from the story you described, it's like you were built for this work, just born right into it. And so you have all those like experiences and insights to bring into the work that you do. So thank you for sharing everything. And like, thank you for just finding the motivation to, I mean, that sounds silly because it's like, once you've lost people and experienced it, there's like, it starts a fire in somebody. So I'm, grateful for you for kind of stoking that fire, I should say.
Yeah, thank you. Well, and I think, it's important for us all to identify, our talents and our strengths and leverage the power and privilege that we have if we have it too. And so, one blessing of my family is that we've always been very open about sexual health in my family. And, something about sexual health with adolescents specifically is if they don't have medically accurate information, they're going to find it from someone, right? And so when I was growing up, I had information and people would come to me. So wanting to be, a sex and drug teacher is that like my job is talking about drugs and it's my dream and I'm so happy. But, it's natural to me to be open and honest about these subjects, about death, about drugs, about sexuality. And I think that's really hard for some people, but to role model that and to be, willing to, come out and be open about it is a talent that I feel like almost obligated to share. But back to the serendipity, I think, yeah, that is a piece of it. And so much like, yeah, the timing of where we're at just in the universe is so amazing to me. And I can't help but wonder, as I was listening to you talk, if somehow, I mean, clearly the COVID-19 pandemic has a lot of influence on a lot of things happening right now, but also just, you know, that opportunity that I had as a peer to train alongside people all over the country. I think it's been a pretty cool opportunity to share ideas, because I have that anticipation that people in traditional 12-step fellowships are going to be resistant to harm reduction and to my ideas. And people just really surprise me everywhere I go. And I think it's just people are becoming so aware of these issues and all of the potential solutions. And like when I talk with people from AA, like maybe the relationship starts like, I don't know anything about harm reduction. I don't know how I feel about that. And then you just say, you know, well, we just want to keep people alive, right? We can't save people who aren't alive. It's as simple as that sometimes. I've had people completely be like, all right, you've sold me. That's all I needed to hear. And then this person, the more I got to know them and they told me their recovery story, it was a harm reduction pathway. And I think it's just one of those dirty words like feminism, where people are that they just don't understand what it means, you know? And so to me, harm reduction is, sorry to get ahead of myself, but you know, in a lot of situations, it can be reducing or eliminating certain substances, but not, you know, claiming full sobriety. And that is just a lot more realistic to a lot of people. Like a big barrier for a lot of people to go into rehab is if they can't smoke cigarettes at the facility. And while I will agree there are biochemical reasons why it's better to quit everything cold turkey, that's just not going to fly for most people, right? And to like maybe quit one thing at a time or work on moderating or mitigating your use is just more comfortable for a lot of people, I think.
Yeah. And no, like, don't apologize for getting ahead of yourself. Segue, because I did want to, as we dive into this topic, I wanted to start by having a conversation around what harm reduction actually is. And I think currently right now, when we talk about harm reduction, a lot of people, we automatically definitely go to harm reduction surrounding like opiate use, because opiate use is such a hot topic right now. But harm reduction can be applied to like other senses of substance use. For me, for instance, like my substance of choice was alcohol, but my first year of recovery, I didn't know how to be like that completely abstinent, sober person. And I practiced marijuana maintenance, which was like a form of harm reduction. I knew I wasn't going to harm myself or others, or, destroy my life the way that alcohol was if I was practicing like marijuana maintenance. A year later, I found that I wasn't enjoying it. So I stopped, and now I'm completely abstinent, unless you count caffeine and nicotine. But that was a form of harm reduction for myself. So it's not just necessarily like syringe access programs or safe consumption sites, but you as the expert, like, tell us a little bit about like what harm reduction is, and maybe even like what harm reduction isn't.
Yeah, well, as I said, I've wanted to be a sex and drug teacher since I was at least 11 years old. And my, methodology has always been that people are going to have sex and they are going to use drugs, and we need to provide them with medically accurate information and resources that exist. Naloxone was invented in 1961, and we only started seeing the real widespread distribution of it as recently as 2016. So it's like, there's tools here that we can use to reduce harm, right? So for me, harm reduction is also all about reducing the harm of our everyday actions. So I love the examples of seatbelts and speed limits, right? No one's going to stop driving, but there are a ton of laws that exist to prevent the really real harm of driving a car, which I think is an excellent example, because I think, when you compare death tolls, it's like driving a car is a pretty dangerous activity, but no one is, and arguably like harmful to the environment, but not many people are stigmatizing those who drive cars, right? And you look at opioids, which are a very dangerous activity, even when they are, pure and directly from a prescription bottle or something like that, or directly from your opium poppy. It's still potentially lethal. So you should reduce the harm. Doctors should warn people and give them Narcan with their prescriptions, the same way cars come with side view mirrors and seatbelts and airbags and all this stuff, right? That didn't exist when cars first came out, mind you. And so, yeah, it's just about reducing that harm. And so for me, like, I think marijuana maintenance specifically, and especially in the context of Colorado, that is like a huge area of focus for me. There are so many people who utilize cannabis medicinally or recreationally who may in the past have had an issue with alcohol or opioid use disorder or methamphetamines or whatever. And, I have clients where it's like, yeah, I would way rather you smoke cannabis than methamphetamine or drink alcohol, because the choices that you're going to make, on these different substances, that's not to say that cannabis is 100% risk-free, or that it doesn't, that, people can't become addicted to it, because addiction is not all about the substance. It's a lot about the person, which I had a personal experience with a puzzle recently that I could not stop working on until it was finished. And I was like, yeah, because I am an addict for real. So yeah, it's just, how can we keep people safe? And just the stuff we're seeing right now is so scary with adulterated pills and things like that, where it's like, this is real, people. Kids and young people are taking pills. I saw some terrifying stuff this year. Just, I can never tell you 100% if what was going on, but like a lot of these kids may not have any idea what they're taking. They may have never taken a drug before. They may be peer pressured into taking this pill that they think is safe, they think is clinical. And it's not, it's fentanyl. And so it's like, yeah, we can seriously reduce some unnecessary harm just by distributing fentanyl test strips and Narcan. And that's, what it's all about, is keeping people alive, keeping people safe and healthy, contracting HIV. Never mind what that costs the government. I know syringe services save $7 in every prevented, HIV case, but also just on the individual, the emotional and physical toll that takes. Even if you're dealing with something curable like hepatitis C, no one wants to have to go through that. So again, like if people are choosing to use, we can prevent, the chances that they have some really negative health effects, whether it's disease or infection, or things like that. And so, yeah, it's in some fields, it's obvious that, driving a car can cause death. So let's make all these laws to protect people, right? And now we're starting to see that, yeah, a lot more reflected in terms of opioid use disorder treatment.
Yeah. Well, I like that you brought up too, like the adulterated pills. Jesse Hainers, my co-host, usually took a sick day today though, but he's out in Sacramento and he works with like transitional aged youth. And a couple months ago, they lost one of their kiddos who thought he was taking Xanax. It was like a pressed pill in Xanax form. And it turned out that there had been fentanyl in it. So obviously it was not coming from like pharmaceutical manufacturers, but there are like these pill mills, if you will, creating these drugs that are, you don't know what you're getting. So even if you're not an opiate user, I mean, it's ending up in, what you think came from a pharmaceutical company, it's ending up in cocaine, methamphetamine. So even people that are on the other end of the spectrum, as far as like what the substance does, they can be experiencing overdoses. So that was something that him and I had talked about too, like people sort of saying like, well, we're not opiate users. We don't need to have education or anything around this. And it's like, it's not necessarily about you. It's like your community, what field are you working in here in, Durango? Like it's probably a lot more rare to walk down the street and see somebody like experiencing an overdose in public, but not to say it wouldn't happen. But, in bigger cities, like you might see that in certain neighborhoods. And even just being equipped with the information, how to access it if you have it on you, like being able to save somebody's life so that they have the opportunity to recover. I mean, I'm like, I don't know that any of my friends are at risk of having a heart attack, but there's AED units all over the place,
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's kind of the mutually agreed upon goal of harm reductionists, at least among a lot of folks I know, is that Narcan should be where every AED is, because it's basic first aid. And the presence of fentanyl in all of these drugs is making, it so much more relevant to everyone because, yeah, I mean, I don't know what everyone thinks about when they think about these rich resort towns, but cocaine and Aspen go hand in hand. And I've had reports from police officers that all the cocaine has fentanyl in it. Mm-hmm. And, I love to present it that way because I think we tend to think about this stereotypical, unhoused, impoverished individual using needles on the street. But in reality, most overdoses happen at home. The majority of overdoses in Colorado are still due to prescription drugs, even with the insurgence of fentanyl. And a ton of people use drugs like MDMA and cocaine recreationally. And then, we've seen reports of a Xanax press in our community locally. So somebody here making Xanax. And then what we're seeing all over the nation is a huge popularity of fake blue 30s. They're Percocet blue 30s that are actually fentanyl. And we know that that's getting trafficked through I-70 through Colorado. And those have really infiltrated the whole just drug scene in the same way that people, historically would move or do move from prescription opiates to kind of stronger, less adulterated, but not in the same way that we're talking about with fentanyl. But, heroin is kind of pure, stronger high than opioid pills like Vicodin or whatever. So I think the specific statistic is 83% of people in Colorado who enter treatment for opioid use disorder started with someone's old pills. So people commonly move from the pills to heroin and now from heroin to fentanyl and are actively seeking out these blue perk 30s or fentanyl patches or things like that to get, that next best high, because as we can tell from just how lethal the fentanyl is, it's a lot stronger. So it's a much greater high with a much greater risk of overdose.
Right. Yeah, it surprises me that drugs like fentanyl are available for people to like pick up at their pharmacy with just how powerful it is. I mean, working as a peer coach, like I know I worked with people that were managing pain. I know that there's definitely folks out there that need pain management. I've never experienced chronic pain, so I don't know what that's like, but I still, start to think, I'm like, if people have to go to a methadone clinic for daily dosing, like, why aren't we applying that same sort of mentality to substances that are as strong as fentanyl that are obviously getting out into the community and being misused? And yeah.
Well, and what we're seeing mostly is illicitly manufactured fentanyl that's produced in generally Southeast Asia, shipped to Mexico and coming up. But the whole, clinical application of fentanyl is fascinating to me. I am a chronic pain patient. I've basically had chronic pain my whole life, and it's been something I've heavily been working on in the past few years. And again, I really think of my recovery as starting at 23 when I started dealing with my mental health issues, even though I didn't actually stop drinking until I was 28. But I stopped using like my drugs of choice, the hard ones, even earlier than that. So it's like, again, this harm reduction pathway of a lot changes over time. And I still have chemicals that I want to omit from my diet eventually. Sorry, I just went off on a little tangent there. Hold on, it takes me a second to look back sometimes.
No worries.
What was I saying before?
We were talking about like clinical application.
Clinical application.
Chronic pain. No, it's okay.
It's part of my brain recovery. So What's so fascinating to me about fentanyl, though, clinically, is that it was designed to treat children's pain, which is it's a bizarre medical story, where, you know, pain in general, like the opioid epidemic that we are in right now is not the first opioid epidemic, but it's a response to the development of Oxycontin in the mid 90s, which was a response to the difficulties of treating pain, which is a purely, you know, objective experience, or I'm sorry, a purely subjective experience. And so it's very difficult for a doctor to objectively be like, oh, you're in how much pain? And so there's been a lot of issues in the medical community with treating pain. Additionally, you know, medicine in general is fascinating because it's really only been a respected field for like 200 years or so. And I don't know how great it's necessarily doing, especially in the realms of chronic pain. And so they used to not even think children were capable of feeling pain like adults could. And so then somehow we flip-flop, do a twisty turn, and then develop fentanyl, which is 100 times stronger than morphine to treat children's pain. So you see it in patches, IVs, and lollipops. And then the stories I've heard about people using fentanyl clinically are just bizarre. A woman told me, who worked in 2 different regional hospitals here, that they would Narcan babies all the time because they were giving the moms fentanyl during childbirth. And it's like, well, could you like not give her fentanyl? And, you know, there's a million weird stories out there about just pain management and fentanyl and how weird it is. But it's hard because chronic pain patients really have become a victim of this, where they're, you know, putting these restrictions on opioid prescribing and things like that. And I, you know, as a chronic pain patient, am stuck between a little bit of a rock and a hard place on that issue, because there have been studies that show that opioids really aren't good at treating chronic pain. They really don't reduce as much pain as ibuprofen and acetaminophen in combination do. And for me, you know, even the most recent time I was hospitalized for pain, which was in July, I don't want you to make the pain go away. I want to treat the source of the pain. But you know, what I see in the field is there are a lot of people who, for whatever reason, can't treat the source of their pain. And modern medicine doesn't have a lot of good options. A lot of people can't get the surgeries that would potentially help fix their problems for whatever reason. A lot of people can't take ibuprofen or acetaminophen. So, you know, my opinions and what I do to manage my chronic point don't matter at all. Every person should have the right to the treatment of their choice. Adderall is basically meth chemically, and Vicodin is chemically heroin. But that doesn't mean it can't have, you know, positive clinical uses, that people can't benefit from it, and that people shouldn't have the right to determine their own care. But it's difficult when doctors aren't giving accurate information, and then 10 years down the road, some new psychiatrist is trying to take your Adderall or your benzos or your Vicodin or whatever. We create these huge contentious issues. But the bottom line is, I think it's, you know, we see countries like Switzerland, Vancouver, and Canada, where they have this medicalized model where people come in and get their heroin like they would their Vicodin or their methadone, and there aren't any problems, you know? So it's really the laws in our country around these drugs that are creating all the problems, and trauma and mental health issues that are creating this unhealthy relationship with these chemicals.
Right. Yeah. No, you make a good point. And really interesting to touch on that, because I haven't really spoke to a lot of professionals that are actually like experiencing chronic pain, because it is, you know, when I worked as a peer coach, I was working in an integrated healthcare system. And that was one of the biggest issues, though, for the providers, was like, how do we determine if folks are like legitimately experiencing pain, or if they have become dependent on opiates and are, you know, manipulating the system in order to get access to the substances. Because then that's a lot of liability on the providers too, if, you know, depending on what happens. But, you know, then there's also the topic of like stigma within the healthcare industry too. And even just kind of labeling folks with chronic pain as addicts, even if they are not. Again, I've never experienced chronic pain, but I've known people, and I've like talked to people. Like I couldn't imagine. We did do a thing when I was working there. We launched this pilot program, and it was like an alternative pain management group. And we were trying to explore these holistic approaches to pain management that in no way would, have the benefits of a drug like OxyContin. But, we talked about like pain journaling so people could identify like what triggers their pain. We talked about nutrition because some foods can be inflammatory, some foods can be anti-inflammatory. We explored a lot of different modalities. Unfortunately, we lost funding after our first like pilot series. So we had about 5 participants complete this, like, I think we did it for 8 weeks. And they actually did experience some benefits and like reduction of pain, or at least being able to identify, because sometimes people would get pain flare-ups. They didn't know where they were coming from, but through exploring those like pain journals, they were able to at least start to identify and mitigate the pain a little more so. And then I think there's also the concept of us, like, sometimes like we talk ourselves into things like hurting a lot more than they actually do. And we center all of our focus onto it, and it actually creates more pain just because we're focusing on it.
Yeah. And I just think the issue with, prescribing independence is so difficult because like anyone will develop dependence to opiates within 5 to 14 days is what most studies show. And most opiate prescriptions are for 2 to 4 weeks. So it's like, at that point, when your prescription is over, you are going to be in pain because you're going to be in withdrawal. And like opiates are safe to use because they don't really hurt the organs of your body, but they can mess up your rational thinking. So it's also like we think that they're helping us more than maybe they even are. But I digress because again, it's a hard issue because everyone's biochemistry is different. And I just think it's like life-threatening to discontinue any opiate medication, whether it's Suboxone or Vicodin, so again, I just think people have the right to do whatever they want. But, I feel like, and it's interesting listening to you talk about it because I follow like some great Instagram pages and always have these awesome motivational memes about like anxiety and depression and chronic pain and all these things because I myself am like still trying to figure it out. And I just feel like, and I'm not 100% at this at all. It's a process and a practice every day. Right. But I do feel like if we're not sleeping enough, eating right, drinking enough water, getting the right amount of exercise, like we can't really look at, like, we all want a silver bullet, right? We all want a quick fix and an easy solution in our culture, but it's like diets are nothing. You have to make lifestyle changes if you want to be, healthy. And that, often means getting healthcare services too, which can be very daunting and frustrating and a lot of back and forth. But it's just like we can't even really look at other stuff unless we're focused on those, because I feel like we're so bad at those things as a culture and they're so important to our health. And then for me, just yoga has been like a life changer. And I know a lot of people hear that and they're like, yeah, whatever. But it's like, I'm not blowing smoke. Like, it has changed my life. I can fall asleep at night most nights and not be like so consumed, because I think, when you said that, I just had this vision of lying in bed where it's like you're so focused on it, because that happens too for me and my partner. Like when you can't fall asleep and you're so focused on the fact that you can't fall asleep that it's keeping you up. And that happens with my pain. I'm so focused on the pain that it's keeping me up and it's getting more painful.
Yeah. Well, I know we're like kind of veering down a different rabbit hole, like away from the topic of harm reduction, but I think it is, like when I think of like harm reduction services or harm reduction centers too, especially if we're talking about people that would benefit from harm reduction services that are experiencing chronic pain, it's like these centers can have information and resources to help people, like moving forward if they are like, well, I have chronic pain and I need other ways to mitigate it if I do want to move away from substance use. So that's, one of the benefits too of like these centers is that, if folks decide that that's the route they want to go, like they have this sort of landing place where people, again, are treating them with the respect and dignity that they deserve. And then if they want information, it's there.
Yeah, and thank you for letting me diverge for a little bit, because it just is an important issue. And I think, in rural Colorado, we have a big juxtaposition between our underserved populations and our, wealthier folks, but these issues touch everyone, and just really we want to broaden awareness of that so we can touch these communities more, because they seem to be sometimes less likely to access services because they might not feel like they're relevant to them.
Right. Well, I think there's also the stigma too, like these wealthy Colorado, like ski resort communities, or they're perceived as wealthy, where, and I've even kind of like experienced here in Durango, which isn't quite Aspen or Telluride. Seems like it's working on it, but, because we're these vacation towns, they're like, we don't want to promote services like that, because then it gives people the perception that we have drug users here and we don't want our vacationers to come here and see that. And it's like, well, it's happening, and if we don't have these services, like our community members are going to die, and then those are going to be really great headlines for your ski resort town, when you have all these things happening. But just the whole perception with towns like Aspen, Vail.
Yeah, and it's funny, in Glenwood Springs, we're right on I-70, so we're the gateway to Aspen and on your way from Grand Junction to Vail and Denver. And the city of Glenwood specifically has taken like a hard stance against homelessness historically for as long as I can remember, trying to do all of these things to basically discourage homeless people from gathering downtown, things like that. And it's like, okay, so first of all, that's not going to work. And second of all, it's Colorado and we're on the interstate. People have been coming to Colorado in mass since the 60s, whether they're moving here or traveling through here. We are a state known for, recreation, known for being somewhat progressive, especially more and more in recent years, known for being front runners in drug policy. So it's like, people are gonna be coming here, so get used to it, And we actually had in Carbondale, so the town I grew up in, and where we really want to centralize our work because it actually is like a really uniquely located town in the sense that it's equidistant to a lot of surrounding areas, such as Paonia, Eagle, Aspen, Parachute, and also a lot of rural communities. And sorry, I had another brain blank moment. But in Carbondale,
you're the interstate and people coming through town, just homelessness, because it was what you were talking about. The Glenwood Springs has like a stance against homelessness and discouraging people from.
Yeah, I don't know where. Gosh, I lost something there. Sorry, one second. Oh, yeah, thank you. Sorry, that keeps happening to me. I get so excited about what I'm talking about that I don't know what it is. So there was an article that was shared like all over Facebook by all of these people about Carbondale being the up and coming arts town, the next Aspen. Woohoo. It's definitely been happening for a long time. Very artistic town, very, focused on environmental agriculture, super, super cool little town. But what's synonymous with art is substance abuse.
Yeah.
And so it's like, we're getting a lot more people moving here. We're becoming known as this art town. We have still a lot of young people moving here from all over the country because of marijuana decriminalization. So it's like, this is going to be a growing issue as our communities continue to grow. And it's been an issue in our communities. So it's time to just acknowledge that these things that we're proud of might also attract things that we wish weren't happening, but are happening. And as far, I just, so much we talk about enabling. Schools don't want to enable, all these places that don't want to carry Narcan. They don't want to endorse drug use, right? And it's like, I respect that, but I don't want to wait until a student dies for you to realize that this is an important part of first aid, you know?
Yeah, I know. Yeah, there should be more education. I'm not sure what even drug education looks like in schools these days. Are you familiar with that at all? That would be something interesting to explore.
Yeah, actually, I know Mesa County is abstinent only, so I don't know about what it looks like south of there. And then in Garfield County, I have been pretty, connected with the group that does more sexual health education. They just had like a change of leadership, so not 100% sure what's going on there. But I know Garfield County has been really focused on consent and also peer-led programming. So, teens kind of designing programs on consent and what that looks like. And I'm actually have like fingers crossed, my dream job, have been collaborating with the Carbondale Police Department to hopefully be the one that provides some drug education in our local high school. So I am really hoping that expands into even more. We also have started working with one of our school districts to try to get the ball rolling on getting Narcan in the high schools. So, we're still in early stages there. I know from my experience growing up in Garfield County, I was really lucky for the health education that I had, but I think that is definitely disparate across Colorado counties, that they're not all like that. And a lot of kids aren't learning anything at all. They're not getting anything.
Well, I'm glad to hear that there's some like progressive conversations happening with like plans to take action. Because when I was in school, it was like the DARE program, which honestly, like my first arrest, I got brought to the hospital. I was 11 years old, and just like serendipitously, my DARE officer was there. Which, not to like discredit him, like he was providing a curriculum that he was told to, but I think programs like that, honestly, like made me really curious, and didn't really provide, like obviously we don't want to like encourage teenagers to use drugs, but the reality is that it's going to happen. So like providing education around like what happens, providing education around like the correlation between trauma and substance use, but then also most importantly, like providing education for like how to help yourself or your friends if that is the route that you go, like how do we help keep these people alive, what's out there. Yeah, I think that's so important. So I'm really happy to hear that on the Western Slope those are happening, because it should just, we shouldn't be shaming. I mean, I think we all know that we've got to move away from this just say no whole conversation. And I think younger generations, like that is definitely the theme that's happening, but still a lot of work to be done.
Yeah. And I will say, reflecting back on it, my drug education was pretty abysmal. It was fear-based DARE stuff, but I had really good HIV prevention education. And I actually recently learned that it was like this amazing person in our community was responsible for that. So unfortunately, I don't necessarily know, right now what's happening in the schools, but I do feel lucky like for the education that I got in this community. And there's a lot of options for schools around here, but I got all my drug education at home. I was trained about what to tell the DARE officers before I even ever met them. I was prepared for what the DARE officers were going to tell me and what was incorrect about that. And so I, again, was lucky to have, but it's interesting, even in my household, there was so much denial and dishonesty, and there wasn't openness about individual use, but there was at least openness about what these drugs were. Because I remember, like one of our DARE officers, when I was like older too, in like 6th grade, was really lumping all drugs together into like this fear mongering thing. But also, for better or worse, we grew up in a pretty interesting environment too. And I've been thinking about this a lot recently, just some of the like really quintessential media elements of our upbringing, such as South Park and Jackass and Tom Green, and these kind of like pretty explicit things for young kids. Like I was 8 years old. So I was I was in third grade when South Park started, that's how old the kids are in the show. And that taught me a lot more than I ever learned in school.
Gosh, no kidding. Oh, geez. Wow. That's an interesting thing to think about. Yeah. We did have a lot of access to some explicit stuff. And not only that, like being influenced by that at such an influential age too. That's pretty interesting to think about. Even like Jackass though too. I think like a couple of those guys are actually in recovery now themselves or trying to find a sustainable recovery.
Oh yeah, Steve-O is a big recovery advocate. And then I know some other people from like that whole community, yeah, also, and some people who are still, working on finding their best quality of life.
Right.
I'm a big fan still, because yeah, it's cool too. Another serendipity that someone who was maybe a negative influence earlier on in my, developmental pre-adolescence, that really special time in a girl's life, that later could be, a positive influence and a role model is very cool.
Right. Yeah. Just a great example too. I think that I love seeing that in the media too. Classic examples of showing that people can and do recover. And also kind of going back to our topic, like sometimes people need access to those harm reduction services in order to turn that corner or, stay alive long enough. All right. So harm reduction services, just kind of like want to recap real quick. So like harm reduction though, I think a lot of people think about syringe access programs or even safe consumption sites, which I just want to note, by the time this airs, it'll be a couple months old, but New York City just opened up its first safe consumption site a couple of weeks ago. And I think I remember seeing a headline like the second day or the day that they opened, they reversed 2 overdoses and saved 2 people's lives that first day, which is just amazing because now that's not 2 numbers, to add to the death toll. So I think a lot of people think of that, but harm reduction, some other things too. Like what else encompasses, like just to recap before we kind of move forward, what are harm reduction services?
Yeah. So when we're talking about opioid use disorder, I think it's the CDC defines like the 3 pillars of harm reduction as medication assisted treatment, Narcan specifically, and then syringe service programs. But generally syringe service programs kind of like encompass this wide variety, right? So of course we give out sterile syringes. We also do sterile syringe disposal. In Colorado, there's a cool program, a mail back program with CDPHE where you can get your own sharps container that comes in a box and you can mail it back. If you want some contact info on that, let me know, because that's a free program. So that's super cool. And then, I love this because I learned this from working with other programs across the state. We also carry meth pipes and meth pipe mouth covers because if we can move people away from injecting to smoking their drugs, because a lot of people inject meth too, and you can smoke heroin, that greatly reduces overdose risk. So we also give, safe snorting supplies, safe smoking supplies, anything we can do to reduce the spread of disease from sharing, because you can transmit HIV or hepatitis through cuts in your nose if you're sharing, tutors or pens or straws, dollar bills. Disgusting. It doesn't bother you at all when you're in the bathroom at the bar, but think about how gross that is for just a second to use a dollar bill to ingest your drugs. And same with your mouth, especially people who are in active regular use. There's often sores on the lips or on the inside of your mouth, especially if you're using metal pipes. So, you can transmit disease that way. So having your own gear that you can use every time is super important, and all the hygiene supplies that come with that. And, really whatever you need in terms of, shampoo, Kleenex, razors, socks, myself and most other programs, we kind of try to have whatever people need in terms of hygiene supplies, and also clothes if we have it, especially during the winter. And then Narcan, naloxone, and fentanyl test strips are also a big part of any harm reduction programming. And then, referrals and peer support services. That's kind of like a whole nother branch of this, right? And so pretty much anyone who walks through the door of a syringe service program is going to get some sort of peer support, because they're going to be talking to somebody there. And most of these programs, again, like ours, are going to be run by people with lived experience, whether they're staff or it's often volunteers, people in active use or in recovery who just want to give back and help this community. And just peer support services are a super cool, like, kind of fledgling field that we're starting to see a lot more, because when people access services, through harm reduction programs and with peers with lived experience, they're able to build meaningful and sustained connections and relationships, where a lot of the time individuals with substance use disorder, that's a whole issue, is that we can't have trusting, sustained, non-judgmental relationships with people, right? And it's all just about meeting people where they are. And what that means is, I actually am reading this biography, and Dr. Drew is in it, and he's talking about like his attitude towards his friend who's struggling. And I just loved it, because Dr. Drew, of course, is, a leader in substance abuse issues in a sense. And he was talking about like just never pushing an issue on somebody, right? Because if we keep pushing something on somebody, so for example, we keep saying, you got to go to rehab, you got to go to rehab, you got to go to rehab, and that person doesn't want that in that moment, we're going to completely alienate that person from us and from that mode of treatment. And so we just have to, when we talk about meeting people where they are, it's, what do you want today? What do you need today? That decision isn't up to us as the peers, it's up to the individual. And, finding out what somebody needs to get to that place where they might be, more receptive to treatment. But I think we can all relate to the fact that if somebody pushes something on us, that we're going to become more and more resistant to it. So it's really just, where are you at in life? What are you looking for? What do you need? You need a social security card. You need a ride to the courthouse. You need a friend to talk to. You need sterile syringes, whatever we can provide for you in that moment. And then, so when your community has a syringe service program, those peers are able to make those connections with our most unserved, not even underserved, but unserved members of the community. We specifically recruit people to reflect the community. So here in our neighborhood, that means we really need Spanish-speaking individuals, because that's a huge proportion of our community that doesn't have culturally appropriate care a lot of the time. I think we're definitely making strides in that area as a community here, which I love to see, because they're, at least 20% of our community. And so there needs to be services in our LGBTQ plus communities, our unhoused neighbors, our people who are experiencing poverty, who are often overlooked and experiencing mental health issues, veterans. There are so many parts of our community who struggle to get the care that they need and to feel, how do I say this, wanted in medical healthcare facilities. And, our medical healthcare facilities are really dropping the ball for people with substance use disorder. And, people tend to get very defensive if their agency is attacked. And I want to make it very clear, like, we have amazing providers. We have a very serious labor shortage, and we have these bureaucratic systems that create unnecessary red tape. And it's like, we're trying to do something different because the old stuff didn't work, but we're trying to do it under the same system. So, like, I think I hear this a lot, that there is this disconnect when you have boots on the ground employees and their activities being dictated by people at a desk. And I see that all over. But the reality is peer services have applications in pretty much all fields. A great thing I heard from somebody is if you're going to work in CPS or family court, you should have a family, because if you're a single woman, it's going to be hard to not judge a woman who can't afford diapers. But if you are a mother, you might be able to appreciate that experience, and that it's not a moral failing of this mom. She needs help, right? And she would love for her baby to have clean diapers. And in the same way, we hear time and time again, you really can't help somebody with substance use if they don't have experience with that. And even, with police, if I have, somebody in law enforcement who's resistant to my approach or to working with me, it's probably not going to be super effective for me to knock down his door. But if I go and enlist the help of law enforcement who are collaborative with me, utilizing them as a peer in law enforcement. So it's just, there's applications all over. I mean, I did a Narcan training one time where it was, 75% Hispanic women, a lot of them had kids, and a woman said something. And I was like, well, everyone in this room is going to listen to you before they listen to me, because you're their peer, And so we need to find the right people and leverage them to make the most impact.
Oh yeah, 100%. Yeah, I see that especially in the recovery field. Even going back to when I was working as a peer in a clinical setting, and people just communicating that, they're more apt to be vulnerable with somebody who has that shared experience, and maybe kind of discount or discredit the person that doesn't. I'm always a big advocate, especially for therapists, because I'm usually therapists aren't in this line of work for funsies, they usually have some tie or some sort of experience with mental health or substance use that drove them to that field, but ethical considerations don't allow them to disclose that often. But yeah, there's definitely more buy-in from an individual when it's coming from a peer or somebody that has that shared experience.
Well, and I think you kind of touched a little on a thing too, where it's there's, stigma and propaganda and judgment that goes both ways. And I noticed this in myself, it's a tendency to assume that certain people, more likely because of their socioeconomic status, aren't affected by these issues. But the reality is that most people are affected by these issues. And there has been people who I have assumed for a long time didn't have any personal experience. And then they came out that they did. And it's whoa, also what is going on that you weren't talking about that before, And so, and we all, kind of process our trauma differently. And some people compartmentalize and don't really show it. And so I think as addicts too, we should give people trying to help us the benefit of the doubt that, yeah, they're not just here for fun. They probably have a deep passion and real reason for being in this work.
Right. Yeah, definitely. Well, so, all right, say anybody's listening to this that they're I don't use drugs. I don't know anybody that uses drugs. Why do I care about harm reduction? How do these services benefit the community at large?
So this is a response that I get a lot. And my number one response is, are you sure you don't know someone who uses drugs? Because like I've said, really trying to broaden that awareness of the dangers of prescription opiates, of prescription benzodiazepines, the reality that prescription stimulants are psychoactive drugs. And I like to be a real pain in the ass about it and talk about that. Yeah, caffeine, sugar, nicotine, these are all psychoactive substances. And my favorite textbook in the world says that 95% of Americans use some form of psychoactive substance on a regular, if not daily basis. And yes, I get it that the side effects of caffeine versus methamphetamine are greatly different, but also we have this huge meth problem in our community, and meth is in a lot of clinical drugs, and even over-the-counter medications have meth-like drugs in them sometimes. So there's just working on reducing this stigma and understanding that we're all in the same boat. I think another thing that came out of the pandemic is we're all experiencing stress and anxiety and depression at this point. And again, we shouldn't be comparing and judging other people's traumas and experiences. Like, we're all hurting as a society. And so even if you really are truly somebody who's not affected by this at all, these are really serious community health issues that affect everyone economically at the end of the day through lost productivity and just, cost to the criminal justice and healthcare systems. So if you care about, the economy, supporting these programs makes a huge difference. I know, Oregon, for example, they decriminalized all drugs, which is actually, again, like a more common practice and a lot less intense than it sounds, but they saved $300 million in 1 year from November 2020 to November 2021 that is now being put back into programs that are more effective. I think it's Portugal that has, they spend about 10% of their funds, government funds for substance use, on punishment and 90% on treatment. And in America, it's like backwards, but they save so much more money and help so many more people by doing it that way.
Yeah, no, the money piece is big. I think about that often, and I think I've talked about it on a couple of these episodes already, because people will be like, I don't want my tax dollars going to that. When it's like, you realize your tax dollars are going to people that are using drugs and other substances. Like, there's the resources of like emergency responders coming to these events where somebody's experienced an overdose, or high utilizers of our emergency departments, detox days, which detox is covered by Medicaid, which is covered by your tax dollars. People don't realize they're already putting their tax dollars, but the way that their tax dollars are being used are not effective. They're not they're not changing anything. So it's like, if we put, I guess that's a whole nother conversation. They're like talking about funding these services through tax dollars, but
so I'll just say, other benefits for people who aren't necessarily substance users or who aren't necessarily affected by this. Switzerland, like I mentioned earlier, they are a very conservative country. And in Johann Hari's book, Chasing the Scream, he kind of outlines how it was very kind of surprising that a country like Switzerland would have such progressive drug policy. But it was because in the campaigning for, the way that they have medical heroin now, they talked a lot about how this protects entire communities in terms of, there's not going to be public drug use or public drug overdoses when you have safe consumption sites and syringe service programming. There's not going to be, needle stick injuries for police officers specifically. That's a huge issue. And for community members in general, we want safe, clean parks. Something, that somebody said, like in an attack towards me when I came out and doing this work earlier this year is, oh, we don't want our small towns turning into Seattle and Portland. Yeah, me neither. Like, I could never live in Portland because I have been to Portland many times, and there are people openly injecting drugs literally like everywhere you go. And that's my goal, is that we don't become Portland or Seattle. I think that, Portland has definitely been working on their stuff. So I don't know where they're at now. It's been a while since I've been to any parks up there, but this is really a community health issue, is that we have people leaving sharps in dangerous places, throwing them where they shouldn't be. A big issue right now is public bathrooms. That's always been a big issue, but we're seeing like a huge problem with public restrooms in our communities, and so a lot of places have put up sharps containers, and that's made a big difference. And so there are a lot more implications for just the broader community to having these programs. They're designed to keep everyone in the community safe and healthy and protected, and to keep our parks and our streets clean and our people clean and safe. So it's really for everyone. And I also think, different people have different levels of, willingness when it comes to first aid in general. Like, not everybody is willing to provide CPR to somebody they don't know, but there are a lot of people who become CPR trained or want to know how to respond in an emergency because, you might work in a library or a gas station or a restaurant or a downtown business or whatever, where you might come across somebody overdosing. And most overdoses, again, happen in the home from prescription drugs. So it's just like, you never really know when you're going to need Narcan and need to reverse an overdose. So if you're somebody who's passionate about first aid, you should want to be prepared.
Yeah, of course, definitely. No, that's a good point. Yeah, it should just be common knowledge. It's such an easy, well, it's a relatively easy thing to learn too. So I don't see why it's not just common knowledge. There's so many skills we learn like in high school that are so irrelevant that we could be like applying these really simple tools within our education curriculums, just so that more people can keep each other alive. What a concept.
Well, and I guess to be fair, the nasal spray has only been around for about 6 years, and there's been a lot of efforts. I mean, now every police department from Aspen to Parachute carries Narcan. So, thinking about it in that way and just how slow things move sometimes in this country, there's been a lot of fast movement. Is kind of leading into another question you have. Things are there's a lot of positive momentum. So I think in 20 years, that will be the standard.
Yeah, well, so yeah, I think you're alluding to, I mentioned earlier I think it's the first ever safe consumption site is the one that opened up in New York City. Was that early December, late November?
I was late November. I was just looking that up actually for my podcast. So I believe it was actually Tuesday, November 30th. And it's the first, I like the way they phrase this. It's the first government approved supervised consumption site, because most harm reduction work starts illegally by people just doing this stuff on the streets, right?
Right. Yeah. Well, don't most good things have to start illegally?
Yeah, that's where we got syringe service programs. And, that's still a lot of, not that it's necessarily illegal everywhere, but I mean, that's almost what we're doing is a lot of just individuals going out and getting Narcan and whatnot to their communities directly in lieu of there being a government agency doing that.
All right. So New York is leading the charge. I know I've seen things in the news, read things about like Washington and Oregon, trying to push for these types of resources. Do you know, like, are there conversations happening in Colorado around safe consumption sites? Has there been progress or hindrances for that?
Yeah. So there absolutely is movement going on. And there, I think is an NPR article about the first site that opened in New York. They actually mentioned, I knew that there had been conversations in Philadelphia, and they actually mentioned Philadelphia, Denver, Seattle, and I believe Washington, D.C., and maybe San Francisco as states that have been trying to open supervised consumption sites or safe injection spaces, whatever you want to call them. It's all the same thing. Right. But I know that Lisa Rayville with the Harm Reduction Action Center out of Denver has been a huge voice. She actually has a TED Talk about supervised consumption sites. And I also know that she, I think her TED Talk at this point is at least a few years old. She's had a lot of pushback, and she has been fighting tooth and nail for this cause. I mean, the Harm Reduction Action Center is, I believe, the biggest independent syringe exchange program in the state. Lisa is an amazing role model. She's been my mentor through this progress, and she's just a freaking rock star and kicking so much butt and making so many amazing changes and moves. And so the fact that Denver has already, been a real front runner in, marijuana decriminalization and other issues, psilocybin, a lot of the MDMA studies are happening in Colorado. So I, again, have a lot of optimism. Here locally, we haven't really had any. I feel like supervised consumption sites have definitely been brought up a couple of times, but, we're looking at like the hierarchy of services. So for me, I'm like, okay, I'm going to start this syringe service program. And my next goal is to bring a methadone center here. Mm-hmm. And it's been super amazing in the past few years, and I've been a big part of this. There have been a lot more players in opioid response in the Roaring Fork Valley specifically. And so that's really like strengthening our ability as we all work together to, get peers into jails and to get Narcan training out there and to get some sort of detox program that is actually going to work and help our people through, withdrawal management and things like that. There's actually a residential detox program going on, being proposed and worked on in the works in Basalt, and then a withdrawal management, which I don't even know if anybody knows what that means, but a center being proposed and developed in Glenwood as well. But so, I think we're far away from supervised consumption sites, but we're going to have a methadone clinic in Glenwood Springs within the next 6 months to a year. And my colleagues and I did not see that coming. And that happened, like another group just made that happen. And that's like so exciting to us, because for us, it's like, cool, that's one less thing that we have to do is create this, because we, for how much money our communities have in Vail and Aspen, we have very, very little services for behavioral health or for people with substance use issues. And so it's great to see, excuse me, all the momentum.
You don't have those problems. Why would you need those services?
Exactly. And that's, oh my gosh. So Pickens County had they had some drastic, data increases. And so it's like, yeah, everyone knows that the problem is here, and you telling me that there's not a problem, and then a ton of overdoses in 2020. Yeah, there's definitely a problem. But it's just like, we just sweep it under the rug, right? We just act like maybe it's not a problem because there's not, as many overdoses or issues in the street. Like the police feel like they're containing the problem in a sense. I'm not sure. But regardless, I think that with the amount of momentum that we've had locally, with the things happening at the federal level, I think it's just today that they released this SAMHSA federal harm reduction grant. They've allowed federal funding to now go directly to syringes, which has never been allowed before. In here in Colorado, literally the year we started, which was 2020, they changed legislation so that nonprofits can operate syringe services without our county health board's approval, which in counties of less than 100,000 people, our county health board is our county commissioners. If I had asked them in April for approval to open a syringe service program, I have a pretty strong feeling they would have said no. So the fact that we didn't have to ask them at all, I think like today they might be getting convinced like by our attorney, because like then we had our attorney general in Colorado come out to this meeting in Eagle with these county commissioners and with all these people doing the work, advocating fentanyl test strips, advocating Narcan and syringe services and all of these harm reduction programs. So it's like getting harder and harder to deny, the same way naloxone has existed forever, or for a lot longer than we've been using it for. Syringe service programs have been shown for the past 30 years to be much more effective at reducing these issues created by things like the opioid epidemic than our traditional criminal justice methods. All that's doing is making money for the people who already have money and keeping the poor poor, right? So I'm super excited. I just think like so many things have been so serendipitous in the past couple of years. And when Lisa Rayville behind that campaign in Denver, I think Denver, I think Seattle too, they have some great stuff, in San Francisco. These are all cities that have been doing a lot of awesome stuff, not even just in the past 10 years, but over the past, several decades as far as these things are concerned. So again, I think we'll see supervised consumption in Denver relatively soon, now that New York has the first one. But it'll be interesting too to see what happens, reading about the continued kind of contentious politics. And, like part of me is like, yeah, we're going to get supervised consumption. We're never going back. But then I think about the lessons learned in Texas, and it's like, we're still in the middle of this. Like the federal government is still not 100% on board. So it's still possible that we could have kind of a 1 step forward, 3 steps back situation with supervised consumption.
Yeah, will you speak a little bit more to that, the events in Texas?
Well, I just mean with, the basic criminalization of abortions after 6 weeks. And, to me, like how can we, so it's a little bit of a different subject, but to me,
Okay.
very related, and just
Right.
like a big step backward. And with our Supreme Court now, and it's just like you can never be sure that your rights are protected, because things go back and forth. And so I think abortion and marijuana and drug decriminalization, they're all very similar in the sense, we have this federalism in our country where states have more power than the federal government. Canada is opposite. So that's why Canada has just across the board been able to decriminalize a lot of things. But here we have this constant struggle between states, and marijuana is a great example. States trying to do things that aren't federally legal. And are the feds going to allow that or not? Like, you could still technically, and this happens, get in trouble with the federal government over cannabis charges in Colorado. So it's like similar with abortion, similar with supervised consumption. There's contention between the federal and the state governments there. And so there's always the opportunity for federal or state or Supreme Court governments to intercede or supersede what's already going on.
Right.
Unfortunately.
We invented a really sensible system, right?
Well, and I love, that's Canada, they incorporate, their articles of incorporation were written right after the Civil War in America. And so they were like, okay, we're not going to make that same mistake and give the states all this power. So just keep the thought.
Yeah. Oh, goodness. Well, this has been a really diverse conversation. And I just love this topic because there is so much to discuss when it comes to harm reduction. So I'm really happy to have had you come on the show and us go down our rabbit holes. I got two more questions, but before I get to the last question, just as a person working in this field of harm reduction in a rural part of Colorado, in your opinion, how does the work in a rural community around harm reduction differ from what harm reduction is in a city, or what are the different challenges or barriers for rural communities and harm reduction?
Yeah, I think that there's fewer centralized congregation points for people who use substances, especially injection drug users in our rural communities. There's not really as many downtowns like the 16th Street Mall or Colfax areas where there's going to be a lot of congregation. We do see that in Glenwood Springs, but that's, I think, another thing that makes it unique is we have all of these little towns, and each town, even within the same county, can have very different, political leanings. They can have very different community cultures, and they can have very different substance use trends. So in Aspen, we see a lot more cocaine and pill use. In Rifle, we see a lot more methamphetamine abuse, which is, just definitely indicators of socioeconomic statuses between the towns. And then we see heroin all over, so it's kind of learning how to adapt to each small community, but also recognizing that these small communities make up a larger community. I think about this a lot when I'm driving around, that I have to travel, on average, 20 to 30 minutes to get to the next town over, or I have to travel, a couple miles from my house into town to go to a grocery store. If I lived in a city, it might only be a couple blocks, but it would be the same time, right? So in this sense, Aspen to Parachute to me kind of feels just a big city, right? And the communities are interconnected where we have people working and commuting and, being with family or learning. For me, I have family that lives from Aspen to Rifle, all over. I commute all over for work. And Colorado specifically is kind of a transient state. We have a lot of people who travel here and a lot of, people who might be experiencing homelessness, but it might be a more temporary situation, or people who are living in their vans, and these kind of more unique types of homelessness that we're seeing a lot more. So, Colorado is not only is it a stop on the way to California, but it's almost like just its own destination for a lot of people. I mean, we have, our Lyft operators come from all over the world in our resort towns. We have colleges, we have cannabis, we have all these things, right? And then even there are people who live here travel all over the state for work, like obviously, thank goodness we have Zoom, but I work with people in Durango and Buena Vista and Steamboat in Denver and Pueblo and Alamosa. And we have clients that travel between all these areas all the time. So that's a really just unique thing, is there's so much movement and trying to figure out like where is the best place to capture people. And I think that that's been our biggest struggle. What is the best way to advertise, to reach people without like just going up to everyone on the street, giving them Narcan, which we'd love to do, but we're not quite there yet, where we don't want to, offend people or have people think we're assuming things about their life. So it's like, how do we reach our people in these communities that are kind of spread out? And, people might be, often these little pockets doing their own thing. And so we offer delivery. And I think that that's a really important part of rural services, because people might not be able to make it to our service hours for whatever reason. People might not ever be able to make it to us, and so it's just the nature of our community is that people are just kind of all over the place, and it's hard to kind of centralize and reach people. So it's kind of having to go all around creation to connect with our people.
All right. So definitely in need of some sort of like mobile units to help facilitate that.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And that's something we were just kind of even just doing it out of the car. And now we have some, locations that we operate out of, but still being able to offer, delivery services, and to have like a unit where we could do like HIV and hepatitis testing and all these things in one place would just be huge. And then, I think this is true of harm reduction programs anywhere, but our education and advocacy branch, like that's a real big focus of ours in a community where a lot of our folks who maybe are working in opioid use disorder or pain management or hospitals or things like this, our providers need a lot of education. Our schools need a lot of education. Things have changed. We understand addiction in a totally different way than we did 20 years ago. And so I don't necessarily feel like this is more true in a rural community or not, but we sometimes have less access, to education. I mean, if you think of Grand Junction as a rural community, which I'm pretty sure HRSA does, it's a city, but they have, pretty not the best education. They, it's abstinence only. So really, working on education and advocacy in our communities that's geared specifically towards those rural communities, and what we see as, coming through our data, such as the things like more prescription opioid overdose deaths than fentanyl overdose deaths, but like more fentanyl overdose than cocaine, so really gearing the services to our specific populations.
Right. Well, thank you for that. And thank you for all the information that you've brought and sharing your story. I've got one final question for you. I ask all my guests, and it's just, what does recovery mean to you?
Recovery to me means being able to achieve self-actualization and my best quality of life. It means being able to, and these are by no means things I've necessarily achieved yet, but being able to feel comfortable in my own skin, being able to be around my family and have an okay time, being able to have positive relationships with friends, family, coworkers, romantic partners. That to me is a huge, huge part of my personal recovery. But, it's just, am I happy in life? Am I making myself proud? Do I feel good when I wake up in the morning emotionally and physically? And am I living up to realistic expectations that I've created for myself, And that means too, am I letting myself have bad days? Like not every day is perfect. And, I still, I still smoke cigarettes and I still use cannabis. And those are things that I hope to eliminate someday as well. But it's just, and I could start crying because has truly been such a difficult thing coming from my background, but just to, be happy with who I am. That's what recovery is all about to me, to be proud of myself and proud of the way I carry myself and what I give to my community and the people around me. And I'm just super proud of where I've come, even in, 3 years, 10 years, 6 months. Every day I feel like I'm doing a little bit more right by myself and a little bit more right by my people. And it's kind of like reflected too on how they treat me. So it's pretty cool.
Oh, that's beautiful. I love it. Just being happy. Amazing. Well, I appreciate everything. I appreciate the work that you're doing. I definitely, we're on the same side of the state, and Durango doesn't have a ton of harm reduction stuff going on. I think you might have mentioned, somebody down here who is like working on some stuff. I'm working on a planning grant where that is definitely a strategy, but we don't have any action dollars yet. But yeah, so we should keep in touch about that, and see how we might be able to collaborate, join forces. But yeah, before we kind of close this out, thank you again. And do you have like any, I don't know, do you want to share maybe where folks in Colorado can find information about High Rockies harm reduction, or maybe any other agencies? I know you mentioned the CDPHE website where people could access mail-in harm syringe disposal.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, High Rockies Harm Reduction, like I said, we currently serve Aspen to Parachute and seeking to expand, Parachute to Eagle. We currently have 4 service days that we do a week and delivery to the region. And you can find out more about that at highrockiesharmreduction.com. And also the best way to keep in touch with what we're doing is to follow at High Rockies Harm Reduction on Facebook and Instagram. And let me see if I can pull up the mail back information really quick with them, because it is such a cool program. But I also, I'm always happy to point people in the right direction of harm reduction resources in their area. And so there is, another syringe exchange program in Grand Junction. There's several in Denver, Fort Collins, Boulder, and then also down in Pueblo and Alamosa. And then even, in other counties, like, it's so cool. Like I was saying about how other people are doing this work. And, our hope is to expand these services to all rural communities in Colorado, but some of them are already doing that for themselves. I know Alamosa and Seguache, or I always pronounce it wrong, but they've been expanding their syringe services. I know up in Routt and Moffat counties, they've been expanding just like Narcan kits and overdose prevention kits. So there's a lot of really cool harm reduction work happening all over the state, and it's just sometimes baby steps. But I know that, the Colorado Department of Public Health does have a mailback syringe program. I'm not finding it right off of the top of my head, but they do have their safeneedledisposal.org/state/Colorado. So you can
nice. More info. Well, I'll plug all these into our show notes too, like the website for High Rockies, the Facebook, Instagram handles, all that good stuff. And I can do a little recon too, just to get that website hyperlinked into the show notes so people can just access them with ease. So folks like me in Southwest Colorado, like you're listing all these places, I'm like, that's pretty much the entire rest of the state has these services except for Southwest Colorado. What's up with that?
Yeah, Colorado Springs also, somebody told me that they were starting to give out Narcan and fentanyl test strips, but they also haven't had anything for a while, which is frustrating because like they're between Denver and Pueblo, but they're like really affected by these issues. So yeah, but it does suck. Like that was literally, everyone but you guys down in the Southwest. But yeah, that's, I try to keep in contact and hear what's going on and however I can support expanding these services. Like my kind of dream is that, we can illustrate how effective these programs are. And whether it's High Rockies Harm Reduction or another organization, we just keep expanding to all of our rural towns. Every rural town should have its own satellite services, because even with good, buses and things like that, it can be difficult to get from one town to the other. So I think making these programs as accessible as possible and just as open to anyone who needs them is the goal, for sure. So I'll definitely, stay in touch for sure.
Yeah, no, we should talk, especially if we get these implementation dollars, because we'll need some experts, because obviously we don't really have any experts in the area. So I will be in touch about that. But yeah, again, thank you so much for just taking the time to sit down with me, share your wealth of knowledge, share your story. And yeah, I'll look forward to maybe working with you in the near future. Who knows, maybe by the time this airs, we'll have like some sort of thing going on.
Yeah, I'll keep crossing my fingers and just praying to the Narcan gods, and we'll get there one step at a time. But it's definitely an honor and a privilege to be here. So yeah, thanks so much again for having me.
Yeah. Oh, actually, before I close out, you do a podcast too. What's that called?
Oh, yeah. Thank you. I always forget to plug that. I host a podcast called Chemical World. It's also a public affairs show. So a lot of Colorado can hear KDNK. You can go to kdnk.org to find your station, or you can just stream it live, and it airs live every second Monday at 4:30 p.m. Mountain Standard Time, or you can find Chemical World wherever you get your podcasts. And it's really just about, drug policy, drug trends, and multiple pathways to recovery.
Awesome. Yeah, I'll make sure to include a link on the show notes. So, very cool. Right on. Well, once again, I am your host, Candace Rose. New episodes of Recovery Corner are available to stream every other Wednesday as early as 5 a.m. Eastern Time. So be sure to tune in next time. And as always, here at YPR, we do recover, and we are in your corner. Thanks for listening.